All right. It's about 10 after, so I'm going to get started. If you're just coming in, grab your seats. So most of us have, at some point, maybe even this morning, used a device like this one. We put some money into the machine, press a button to select the product we want, wait as it tumbles down a chute, and then remove it from the port at the bottom. It's a simple, common action, one that we don't think about very much. But if you've learned anything this semester, I hope that it's that, for better or for worse, in classes like this one, we think about the things that we don't usually think about. And we think about them differently. So in this case, I want to use this simple action of getting a Coke out of a Coke machine as a way to ease into the topic of values in the sports machine. So let me break it down this way. First of all, the Coke machine is a delivery device. It delivers a Coke. But I want you to see also that the Coke itself is a delivery device. It delivers pleasure. It could be the pleasure of sweetness, or refreshment, or alertness, or all of these things and others. Regardless, in this way, the Coke machine itself functions as a device, delivering to you a particular pleasure that you desire. Second, I want you to see that the Coke machine also serves as a kind of mirror, reflecting your values back to you. You invested $1, let's say, into it in exchange for the pleasure you desired. That dollar, in this case, is an expression of the fact that you value the pleasure you get from the Coke. So the transaction tells you that you value pleasure. Or to put it in a slightly different way, that pleasure is one of your values. Third, and finally, I want you to notice that it is your desire, expressed as a value, that fuels the Coke machine, sets it in motion, and makes it run. In these three respects, the sports machine works the same way. You plug into it with the expectation that it will deliver something you desire. The sports machine is a delivery device. But when I say you plug into it, I really mean that you invested something in it, time or money or physical, intellectual, or emotional energy. Whatever it is you've invested in it is an expression, like the dollar that goes into the Coke machine, of the fact that you value whatever you desire to get out of the sports machine. So in this way, just like the Coke machine, the sports machine serves as a kind of mirror reflecting your values. And, as with the Coke machine, in this way, our desires expressed as values fuel the sports machine, set it in motion, and make it run. So the first thing I want you to do today, how many of you would say you plugged into the sports machine at some point this past weekend? You might have participated, you might have just checked a score on your phone. Any kind of plug into the sports machine, raise your hand. Okay, so most of you. So if you did, what I want you to do is just take out a sheet of paper, and I want you to think and to write down what you invested when you plugged in. So what was the equivalent of the dollar? Was it a certain amount of time, a certain amount of energy, some combination of both, a certain amount of money? Write down a few words, just to, time, energy, money, whatever it was. And then write down a few words to express what you were hoping to get out of it, the things that would be the equivalent of sweetness, or caffeine, or refreshment. You're going to come back to that list in a couple minutes, so I want you to make sure you get something down. And if you didn't plug into the machine this weekend, just think about the last time you did. So what you invested and what you were hoping to get out of it. So when you look at the words that you wrote to express what you were hoping to get out of it, you're looking at a list of your values. All right. Now, a Coke machine doesn't just spring up out of nowhere every time you crave a Coke. Neither does the sports machine. It's already there. It's always running. It's waiting for you, built by the choices and actions of countless individuals, groups, institutions, and corporations that have come before us, each of them making choices and actions expressing some value, and each choice and action vying with others to make the sports machine fulfill someone's desire or express someone's particular set of values. The sports machine has been there for hundreds of years, but it hasn't been the same for all those years, as you know, nor is it the same everywhere we might encounter it. It's changing in big and small ways all the time, every second, as people bring their values to it and try to get something out of it, or tinker with it to make it work better for them. It's a complicated enough machine in the present, and it's all the more complicated because of a long and complicated past that still affects its operation in the present. So this history and complexity is why the sports machine seems to deliver some of the things we value very regularly and reliably, and some other things we value only very inconsistently and erratically. It's also why sometimes its ability to deliver one thing we value seems to compromise or conflict with its ability to deliver others. And finally, it's why so many people have so many different opinions about the value of sports. I told you the first week, at least I think I did, that one of the reasons I have for using the metaphor of a machine to talk about sports is that it gives me a kind of concrete, practical action metaphor. I can think about that machine the way I think about any other. If it's working perfectly for me, no problem. I leave it alone, I get in, and I go. But if it isn't delivering what I want, what I value, or if it's delivering some things that I really don't want, that I don't value, or that go against my values, then I can troubleshoot it and think about how to change it, or at least how to change my way of using it. So I want you to go back to the sports machine and to think about the words you just wrote down. And I want you to ask yourself if the sports machine worked for you. Did it deliver what you wanted, what you valued? And even if it did, can you think of anything else it delivered that you don't want? Exhaustion, maybe? Sadness? Homesickness? Anger? Exploitation? Write down a few words to just signal what you might see as inefficiencies or nasty byproducts of the sports machine as you've experienced it. So this second list will be kind of troubleshooting areas for you, which is a main thing I want you to think about and work on this week. But mainly I have two goals this week. First, I want to interest you in understanding your values better and help you to do so. And second, I want to encourage you to think critically about the sports machine in relation to these values and help you to begin to troubleshoot it. So to get started today, I want to talk about some of the many varied values, the desires. Remember that connection between value and desire that people bring to the sports machine. In a way, a couple of weeks ago when we talked about play, we looked at one of the values that a lot of participants hold that first lead them, maybe in childhood, to plug into the sports machine, just simple enjoyment. It could be the enjoyment of just doing the activity itself. It could be the enjoyment of the sense of self, of friendships, or of community that you got from it. And hopefully enjoyment was on the list that you just wrote down of whatever it is that you plugged into the sports machine to get this weekend. But if it is, it's probably there alongside some other things. You might have plugged into it because you value physical fitness, winning, character building, technical improvement, financial or other personal gain. emotional intensity, or relief from psychological stress. I'm going to touch on some of these possibilities and others today to help make sense of all the different kinds of terms and vocabulary that people use to talk about the values available in sports. I've organized them into 4 broad groups: moral virtues, competitive achievement, personal gain, and aesthetic pleasure. As I talk about these different values or desires, one of the things I want to be doing is modeling for you, exemplifying a way of thinking about values that's a little more deep and a little more systematic than what we usually do, and to encourage you to do so for yourself. So as I speak today, I'd like you to be thinking about where your own values fit into these schemas. It may help you to see where certain accepted values mesh or don't with your own, or with your own experience of the sports machine, and hopefully that'll get you thinking this week about how to fix it. Sports build character. For those of us who have spent most of our lives hooked up to the sports machine, this statement just seems like a simple fact. It's like saying the earth revolves around the sun. It's not a matter of opinion, and it's not really subject to debate. At the very most, we might modify it to say, as the cliche goes today, that sports don't build character, they reveal character. But really, it's basically saying the same thing, that sports have an essential link to moral virtue. Developing our moral virtue may not be the reason that as children we first begin to toss a ball around or join a team. But our parents may have signed us up not only so that we would have fun, but because they believed that playing sports would foster certain personality traits in us that they considered moral virtues. Perhaps our coaches on those teams emphasized those traits. And many of us who first participated in sports for other reasons found over time that they seemed to be right. That over time, playing sports imbued our character with moral virtues such as courage, humility, patience, perseverance, equanimity, cooperativeness, and others. We were not alone in this, nor were we, or our parents, or our coaches the first to use the sports machine as a delivery device for moral virtue. In ancient Greece, more than 2,500 years ago, athletic participation was included in educational activities because educators believed it developed arete. That's the Greek word for virtue or human excellence. In Japan, sumo is part of the national myth, and sumo wrestlers are supposed to embody the nation's characteristic moral virtues of dignity, honor, discipline, and strength. And you already learned a few weeks ago that in 19th century Britain and America, the muscular Christianity movement turned on the sports machine to cultivate Protestant moral virtues like initiative, hard work, and self-sacrifice. More recently, the authors of a book called Coaching for Character restated these age-old beliefs. They say they are disturbed by what they see when they watch sports on TV. In their words, quote, bench-clearing brawls, trash-talking, taunting, strutting, college athletic scandals, cheating, drug abuse. They contrast this with what they contrast what they call these disturbing aspects of contemporary sports with the following memory, quote, of watching Mickey Mantle trot around the bases after hitting a home run, head down so as not to show up the opposing pitcher, exhibiting a respect of his opponent and a humility and grace in relation to the traditions and reality of the game of baseball. Sport, they say, is not the only arena, but it can and should be an important one for practicing virtue. Like many others, they use the term sportsmanship to refer to the form of virtue specific to sports. For them, as for many others, it's a kind of umbrella term that refers to a set of character traits. I've got them listed here, the ones they use: courage, discipline, fairness, honesty, responsibility, humility, and wisdom. Sportsmanship, they believe, can be taught and practiced by scrupulously following certain principles: respect for opponents, respect for teammates and team, respect for officials, respect for the game, respect between players and coach. The authors give 3 reasons in support of their call for a return to the virtues of sportsmanship that they think have been lost. First, they claim the nature of sport requires it. Sport is a rule-governed, competitive, athletic play, and without sportsmanship, they say, sport would no longer be sport. Second, they say that the virtues comprising sportsmanship, the virtues making up good character, are useful, not only for winning games, but also in running businesses and developing friendships. Finally, though, their most important reason is that sportsmanship should be cultivated because it is good for its own sake. So, the traits comprising sportsmanship, all of these, they seem pretty desirable to me. I try to cultivate them in myself. I seek them out in my personal relationships. And I would hope that most of you can exhibit them as students. And I'm sure that they are important to you as well. I can see it from the looks on your faces as I'm going through this. I mean, imagine if you're choosing teammates, would you rather have teammates who are fair or unfair, honest or dishonest, responsible or irresponsible, humble or arrogant, wise or foolish? So I can't really think of a good argument against bringing these moral virtues to the sports machine or hoping to get them out of the sports machine. But if we take a closer look, things get a little bit murkier. Consider their list of the disturbing aspects of modern sport that they see as eroding moral virtue. Remember, they listed bench-clearing brawls, trash talking, taunting, strutting, college athletic scandals, cheating, drug abuse. For many of you, it might seem obvious that these behaviors are moral problems, and it might seem like enough to simply say so and leave it at that. But if these things are so prevalent as to require these authors to write a book, we might ask why that's the case. Is it that those who are engaging in these behaviors are simply morally defective beings? Is it, as the authors argue, that nobody has taught these athletes and coaches the importance of sportsmanship and how to be good sports? Either of these or both could be true in any specific individual's case. But there are several other possibilities to consider. First, though the authors claim that the virtues they support are useful and good for their own sake, it could be that some individuals have found that this is not the case. Their own life experience, whether in or out of sports, might have shown them that humility, for example, is not useful. In technical terms, we would say that maybe these moral virtues are not universal. What this means is that even though they may be compelling to us, and even though our own experience has taught us to value them, we can recognize that they may not be valuable to every person in every conceivable situation. It could also be, for example, that some of the behaviors the authors lament, and you should notice that their list, bench-clearing brawls, trash-talking, taunting, strutting, college athletic scandals, cheating, and doping, are a kind of strange set. They're not all the same kind of behavior. So it could be that some of the behaviors that they complain about do not actually express what they believe they express. Take trash talking. The authors seem to criticize trash talking as showing a lack of humility and a lack of respect for opponents. Maybe. But if we see trash talking as an attempt to gain a psychological advantage over an opponent, doesn't that at least imply that you respect your opponent? If you thought your opponent had no chance of defeating you, if you thought of him or her as unworthy, there'd be no need to seek such an advantage, no need to trash talk. I mean, you wouldn't trash talk like the neighbor's 5-year-old when you take them out on the basketball court, right? At least not seriously. Finally, it could be that there are other values that some competitors seek in the sports machine that override their desire to cultivate certain moral virtues. The authors would probably agree that this is happening, but their response would probably be to say that it shouldn't be happening, that no other values are more important than moral ones. This may be true for some people. It certainly seems to be true for them. But again, it may not be true for everyone. It may be that under certain conditions, treating moral values as the highest priority is a luxury that one cannot afford. Simply asserting that moral traits should be the most important values for everyone, everywhere, certainly doesn't seem to account in a very serious way for the complex reality of life in the modern sports machine. So to sum up my way of thinking about these moral virtues, it's important to consider what character traits we value in ourselves and in others. And it's important to engage the sports machine in such a way as to cultivate those traits. But it's equally important to recognize that it is our own particular life experience that has led us to hold these traits as values. And furthermore, to hold that moral virtue, maybe, if it is for us, is the most important value. When we can do that, when we can recognize that, it frees us up to imagine other life experiences that may lead others to hold different moral values, or to place moral virtue in a different place on a scale of their values. In other words, while it's important to understand and be true to our own moral values, we should be very wary of assuming they are universally valuable, and even more wary of using them as a standard by which to judge the behavior of others whose life experience we do not share and may not know. All right, so I mentioned a moment ago that the cultivation of moral virtue could sometimes come into conflict, or at least be in tension, with other values held by those who have plugged into the sports machine. Sports, for example, after all, involves competition, maybe centrally for a lot of people. In fact, even for the authors that I was just describing, the competitive context of sports participation is part of what makes it an excellent arena in which to cultivate moral virtue. However, competition serves many other purposes, and people turn to the competitive gears of the sports machine because they hold other values. Or to put it another way, people engage in competition as a delivery device for something other than moral improvement. Probably the most common thing people seek from competition is the experience of victory. Winning is a value for many participants and spectators. In fact, it's so commonly held a value that for some, the whole point of competition is winning. Vince Lombardi famously said, "Winning isn't everything, it's the only thing." And the entire racing career of fictional Ricky Bobby in Talladega Nights is driven by the haunting words of his absent father: "If you ain't first, you're last." Athletes, coaches, and fans, even journalists, disdainfully reject the idea of moral victories, that is, losses in which they have shown great effort or improvement or some other moral quality. But despite this prevalent attachment to winning, we know that winning is only one form that achievement can take, and only one of the positive outcomes of competition. The desire to win can unlock all kinds of other experiences that we value for their own sake and for what they can contribute to our lives outside the sports machine. Setting goals and priorities, working hard, developing skills, executing what we've learned intelligently under pressure. But to say that the desire to win can contribute to these other important experiences is also, logically, to say that winning is actually not everything or the only thing. It's not even the most important thing. It's secondary to those things that trying to win makes us do and experience. So last week, you read a very brief essay, basically a kind of encyclopedia entry, about competition, in which you learned that the word originally meant to strive with. This suggests that at one time, at least, an opponent was not someone that athletes struggled against or sought to vanquish, but rather someone with whom, together, an athlete strived. For victory, of course, but also for excellence. In other words, in this way of thinking about competition, whether for participants or spectators, it is valuable because it creates conditions facilitating the production of excellence. The outcome in terms of winning and losing is secondary. Of course, it's important to acknowledge that this puts competitors in a somewhat tricky psychological position. They must prepare and compete as though victory were the most important or even the only thing, and that their opponent is an obstacle to achieving victory. But then they also have to recognize and accept that, in fact, doing their best to achieve excellence is the most important thing, and their opponent is not an obstacle, but a vehicle toward that achievement. This doesn't mean that defeat won't be disappointing, but it does imply and require a breadth of perspective that enables us to contextualize defeat as secondary in the broader scheme of competition, seeing competition as designed to bring forth excellence. If the purpose of competition is excellence, then defeat from this broader perspective, though disappointing, is not necessarily an indication of failure. One important implication, in other words, is that competition and victory as values are not necessarily in conflict with the cultivation of the moral virtues I talked about earlier as comprising sportsmanship. One of the things, just parenthetically here, that makes us pay so much attention to winning and losing is that it's cognitively super easy to process. There's a winner and a loser, whereas assessing the complexity of excellence in the course of competition is a much more complicated process and one that doesn't lend itself to simple stories and simple feelings. So that's one reason. There's other reasons, though. It sometimes seems that the value placed on winning actually does jeopardize character-building values or other moral virtues of the sports machine. Or at least it can sometimes lead to behaviors that disappoint or disgust, as it does the authors we talked about. But I'm not actually talking about things like trash talking, which I love, but rather forms of gamesmanship or outright cheating that many, including many of you, may view with disapproval or outrage. So let me take a look at a couple of these cases. So it might seem that when a player flops or dives to create the impression that he has been fouled, there is a clear-cut case of a kind of deception that violates the moral norms of sportsmanship in the name of victory. The rules might not prohibit this behavior, but the moral ethos of fair play dictates that participants should only use athletic skills to gain advantage in competition. Since faking a fall isn't an athletic skill, it has no place in competition. That's the argument against. What this loses sight of, at least potentially, is the fact that the ethos of particular sports evolve over time in accordance with the actual behaviors of participants, whether or not these behaviors actually align with the rules or even the moral norms of those who originated the sport or played it long ago. Considering that evolving ethos of sport, players who rigidly abide by such bygone, unwritten codes will place themselves at a disadvantage. In a sense, it would be similar to, say, a basketball player deliberately avoiding dunking, even when competition calls for dunking, just because for the first 60 years of basketball's history, dunking was frowned upon as an unsportsmanlike violation of the spirit of the game. In a 2014 New York Times article discussing the U.S. men's national soccer team's aversion to diving in international competition like the World Cup, Tab Ramos, a former U.S. player and at that time assistant coach, claimed this: "It's clear that the American nature is to try and make everything fair, to try and be fair to the game. That's just how Americans are." So leaving aside the debatable claim that it really is part of something called the American nature to be fair, Ramos's comment helps show how the question of what it is fair to do in order to win has no fixed and simple answer, but rather varies according to time and sport and culture. So maybe things like trash talking or flopping are just part of the game. Things that elite participants and even some fans accept are part of the evolving ethos of competitive sport. But what about the use of substances that might enhance your performance? There, it seems we can all agree where the line should be drawn. But I'm going to try to play the devil's advocate, just in the interest of provoking you to clarify and become more rigorous in your thinking on the subject. Doping is a kind of cheating in which an athlete uses a performance-enhancing substance that has been banned by the governing body in his or her sport. The governing body may have banned the substance for any number of perfectly good reasons, but the bottom line is that what makes doping cheating is that it is against the rules. And underlying this judgment is the assumption that the rules are being followed by everyone. Because we all follow the rules, someone who breaks them by using a banned substance will have an unfair advantage in competition, and that is unethical. So leave aside for the moment what appears to be an extremely shaky foundation of this argument, the assumption that everyone is following these rules. Leave that aside. Even if that's true, the anti-doping position sets its sight on only one narrow area of performance-enhancing technology: substances. If those who hold that doping regulations should be in place and strictly enforced are truly concerned about fairness, why then do they not ban the use of other forms of performing-enhancing technologies that are not equally available to all competitors? U.S. athletes competing in the Olympics, for example, have access to state-of-the-art equipment, facilities, technical, nutritional, and medical expertise to help them maximize their natural abilities. These resources are expensive. An athlete from a poor nation like Iran competing against an American athlete will not have had the benefit of the same kind of resources. Is the American at an unfair advantage? Most of us would say no, because we exempt economic factors, economic inequality, from our calculations of fairness. But perhaps we should consider these factors since, all other things being equal, access to legal performance-enhancing technology clearly offers a competitive advantage. And that advantage is a function not of athletic ability or of work ethic, but of a non-athletic factor like wealth. If we don't adjust for this sort of factor in our efforts to ensure fairness in competition, perhaps then, on the other hand, we could just be more lax regarding other practices by which athletes might seek to gain an advantage, or simply to offset the typically accepted competitive advantage that wealth gives athletes from certain nations or socioeconomic backgrounds. I'm not saying that we should. I am just saying that the zone of the sports machine where ethical values and competitive values meet is a lot more complex than we like to admit, and certainly too complex for the simple-minded thinking we usually apply to it. Regardless, when the drive to win in competition compromises ethical values, it is often because competition and winning have become strongly tied with still other values. For spectators, it could be the sense of self-esteem or community pride that they have invested in the achievements of athletes and teams. If the spectator is also a gambler, the stakes could be even more tangible. And of course, for schools, franchises, coaches, and athletes, the outcome of competition often has a very tangible impact on the status of other things they value and seek from the sports machine. So I don't want to spend too much time talking about economic value in sports because we're going to spend a whole week discussing markets in just a couple weeks after break. In fact, we're going to spend a whole week because the economic values in play in the sports machine are so enormous and have such a massive impact on so many other components of the machine. So we're going to do a whole week on this. But I want to make a few general points about the commercialization of sports that do bear pretty directly on the question of values. From the point of view of economic value, the sports machine as a whole is a delivery device for entertaining spectacles to consumers, like this. Consumers invest time and money in attending these events or watching them remotely on television or other media platforms. The owners of these media platforms pay leagues and organizations for the right to broadcast the events. And these broadcasters, in turn, generate revenues from advertisers who pay them for the right to market the products of their corporate clients. These clients pay the advertisers to showcase their products in ways that will entice us to go out and buy them. Within this system of the sports machine as a delivery device for entertaining spectacle, athletes are the producers of value, insofar as through their athletic performance they generate a spectacle of interest to fans, who will then go to arenas, tune into events, watch advertisements, buy gear and beverage and watches and other shit. And athletes, at least professional athletes, will be compensated roughly in proportion to the interest they are capable of generating through the excellence of their individual performance and its contribution to the success of a team or franchise. In other words, the greater the competitive success an athlete has, the greater the financial rewards they can expect to derive from the sports machine. Then, the sports machine will also, partly as a cause and partly as an effect of this connection between success and financial reward, deliver to the athlete widespread visibility, recognition, fame, glory, adulation, which might be things they also want. So from the point of view of the elite athlete, the sports machine can become a device for delivering wealth and fame. And to the degree that these are, or are imagined to be, tied to competitive success, the whole system may incentivize an emphasis on winning, with all the positive and negative consequences that can bring. Of course, this same dynamic can apply to coaches and to others playing supporting roles in the process by which athletes generate spectacles of value to consumers. So while fascinating to some fans and students, the commercial aspects of sports represent to others, especially those interested in the moral value of sports, they represent all that is dysfunctional in the sports machine. And indeed, even for fans with little interest in the moral values of sport, the gigantic riches circulating through the sports machine can become a source of resentment. But here's the main thing to keep in mind, as far as I'm concerned, about the commercial values delivered by the sports machine. They are driven entirely by those of us who are consumers. If we didn't watch the games on television, or buy the jerseys, or go to the arenas and stadiums, the entire structure would collapse. In other words, it is our desire for these spectacles and all the varied experiences that we value in them that fuels, not sports, but the commercialization of sports. The same commercialization of sports that some of these same consumers, anyway, so often decry. This might be good to keep in mind when you hear somebody, a fan, a consumer, complaining about the franchise player holding out for extra money, or the college star speaking out about maybe getting paid from some of the millions the university is taking in through their labor, or the athlete crossing some arbitrary ethical line in pursuit of victory. All right, so I'm going to conclude by talking about a form of value that may seem largely irrelevant by comparison with the cultivation of moral virtue, the development of competitive excellence and success, or the generation of commercial value. I want to talk about aesthetic value as expressing a desire we bring to the sports machine. As you already know from various things I've said throughout the term, it's of particular importance to me. Though I play sports because I value other things, most of the time that I watch sports, I'm doing it in the hopes of experiencing aesthetic enjoyment. Now, some of you may be familiar with the term aesthetic already and think of it as referring to works of fine art like paintings. But I actually mean something a little different, related but different, and quite a bit broader when I talk about aesthetic enjoyment or aesthetic pleasure. The term aesthetic comes from a Greek word aesthesis, which just means sensation, as in what you sense. So in the first place, when I talk about aesthetic enjoyment, I am talking about things I can sense, things I can feel with my senses. The smells, sounds, tastes, sensations, physical sensations and sights delivered by athletic performance. So I'm talking, in a way, about embodiment again, though this time about the spectator's embodiment. We're used to thinking about the emotional value of watching sports, the elation of our team's victory, the thrill of a great play, the heartbreak of a last-second defeat, the tension in the closing moments of a closely contested match. But we're less used to recognizing that all of these emotional states are anchored and indeed first felt in our bodies, a racing of our heartbeat, a tightness in the pit of our stomach, a weight pressing down on our shoulders, or a spring driving us leaping to our feet. In this way, the sports machine can deliver to spectators, just as much as to athletic competitors, the experience of embodiment, of being wholly alive as human beings, mind and body together, or it can at least, if we allow ourselves to be open to and aware of the transformative possibility. This should be easy, but it can sometimes be challenging because of the other forces that are reflective of other values operating when we plug into the sports machine, especially when those other values are also values we hold. So this can give rise to mixed feelings. For example, some fans of American football love the sport for its bone-crushing hits, but are beginning to feel a nagging sense of discomfort at their own pleasure because of what they know of long-term tolls such collisions take on the players involved. This is a moment when an aesthetic pleasure, the thrill of violence, conflicts with a moral value, concern for the physical well-being of others. Personally, I feel tensions of this sort all the time when I'm plugged into the sports machine. I'm going to give you one example. When Diego Maradona of Argentina scored the famous Hand of God goal against England in the 1986 World Cup, I was thrilled by the audacity of the illegitimate creativity involved, and I took a political satisfaction in seeing Argentina put one over on its former imperial overlord England on the soccer field. A satisfaction that was confirmed cosmically when Maradona scored a completely legitimate game winner on one of the most brilliant goals in World Cup history. That's that one. On the other hand, the seeker of moral value in me felt uncomfortable with and even ashamed of my own reactions. I got over it. But the case I want to make for taking time to notice the aesthetic value, the aesthetic experience of athletic performance derives from just these kinds of moments when the force of aesthetic pleasure collides against some other value. My pleasure in Maradona's goal colliding against my sense of moral virtue. Aesthetic pleasure, because it arises in our bodies and expresses itself through powerful emotions, can disrupt whatever cerebral schemas we have in place about moral virtue, competitive achievement, or even the commercial bottom line. In a certain sense, I guess I'm saying that aesthetic experiences can bring us face to face with who we really are and what we really value when we plug into the sports machine, regardless of who we like to think we are or what we like to think we value. And I think that I value that because much of what irritates me about the sports machine is the hypocrisy involved, where individuals heading organizations, for example, might publicly profess to safeguard the moral virtues of a sport while blatantly pursuing financial gain in ways that clearly compromise these moral virtues. Caught in a sports machine that so regularly appears as a spectacle of bad faith and dishonesty, In considering that I hold authenticity and genuineness as a value, I find the bracing force of aesthetic pleasure a refreshing reality check. Some of this we're going to get into again next week, because institutions, as we move into the first of the social lenses, are the places in a certain way that these values get deposited and they kind of condense and congeal and become institutionalized. So we'll take a look at a particular example of that next week when we talk about the NCAA and the values that it supposedly safeguards. All right? Have a good week. Practice.